Chapter 13 of The Pathfinder. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. This recording is by Mark Smith of Simpsonville, South Carolina. The Pathfinder by James Fenimore Cooper. Chapter 13. The goblin now the fool alarms, hags meet to mumble o'er their charms, the nightmare rides the dreaming ass, and fairies trip it on the grass. Attributed to Cotton. The embarkation of so small a party was a matter of no great delay or embarrassment. The whole force confided to the care of Sergeant Dunham consisted of but 10 privates and 2 non-commissioned officers, though it was soon positively known that Mr. Muir was to accompany the expedition. The quartermaster, however, went as a volunteer, while some duty connected with his own department, as had been arranged between him and his commander, was the avowed object. To these must be added the Pathfinder and Cap, with Jasper and his subordinates, one of whom was a boy. The party consequently consisted of less than 20 men and a lad of 14. Mabel and the wife of a common soldier were the only females. Sergeant Dunham carried off his command in a large bateau, and then returned for his final orders, and to see that his brother-in-law and daughter were properly attended to. Having pointed out to Cap the boat that he and Mabel were to use, he ascended the hill to seek his last interview with Lundie. It was nearly dark when Mabel found herself in the boat that was to carry her off to the cutter. So very smooth was the surface of the lake that it was not found necessary to bring the bateau into the river to receive their freights, but the beach outside being totally without surf, and the water as tranquil as that of a pond, everybody embarked there. When the boat left the land, Mabel would not have known that she was afloat on so broad a sheet of water by any movement which is usual to such circumstances. The oars had barely time to give a dozen strokes when the boat lay at the cutter's side. Jasper was in readiness to receive his passengers, and as the deck of the Scud was but 2 or 3 feet above the water, no difficulty was experienced in getting on board of her. As soon as this was effected, the young man pointed out to Mabel and her companion the accommodations prepared for their reception. The little vessel contained 4 apartments below, all between decks having been expressly constructed with a view to the transportation of officers and men, with their wives and families. First in rank was what was called the after cabin, a small apartment that contained 4 berths, and which enjoyed the advantage of possessing small windows, for the admission of air and light. This was uniformly devoted to females whenever any were on board, and as Mabel and her companion were alone, they had ample accommodation. The main cabin was larger and lighted from above. It was now appropriated to the quartermaster, the sergeant, Cap, and Jasper, the Pathfinder roaming through any part of the cutter he pleased, the female apartment excepted. The corporals and common soldiers occupied the space beneath the main hatch, which had a deck for such a purpose, while the crew were berthed as usual in the forecastle. Although the cutter did not measure quite 50 tons, the draught of officers and men was so light that there was ample room for all on board, there being space enough to accommodate treble the number if necessary. As soon as Mabel had taken possession of her own really comfortable cabin, in doing which she could not abstain from indulging in the pleasant reflection that some of Jasper's favor had been especially manifested in her behalf, she went on deck again. Here all was momentarily in motion. The men were roving to and fro, in quest of their knapsacks and other effects; but method and habit soon reduced things to order, when the stillness on board became even imposing, for it was connected with the idea of future adventure and ominous preparation. Darkness was now beginning to render objects on shore indistinct, the whole of the land forming one shapeless black outline of even forest summits, to be distinguished from the impending heavens only by the greater light of the sky. The stars, however, soon began to appear in the latter, one after another, in their usual mild, placid lustre, bringing with them that sense of quiet which ordinarily accompanies night. There was something soothing as well as exciting, in such a scene, and Mabel, who was seated on the quarter deck, sensibly felt both influences. The Pathfinder was standing near her, leaning as usual on his long rifle, and she fancied that, through the growing darkness of the hour, she could trace even stronger lines of thought than usual in his rugged countenance. "To you, Pathfinder, expeditions like this can be no great novelty," said she, "though I am surprised to find how silent and thoughtful the men appear to be." "We learn this by making war ag'in Indians. Your militia are great talkers and little doers in general, but the soldier who has often met the Mingos learns to know the value of a prudent tongue. A silent army in the woods is doubly strong, and a noisy one doubly weak. If tongues made soldiers, the women of the camp would generally carry the day." "But we are neither an army nor in the woods. There can be no danger of Mingos in the Scud." "No one is safe from a Mingo, who does not understand his very nature, and even then he must act up to his own knowledge, and that closely. Ask Jasper how he got command of this very cutter." "And how did he get command?" inquired Mabel, with an earnestness and interest that quite delighted her simple-minded and true-hearted companion, who was never better pleased than when he had an opportunity of saying aught in favor of a friend. "It is honorable to him that he has reached this station while yet so young." "That is it; but he deserved it all, and more. A frigate wouldn't have been too much to pay for so much spirit and coolness, had there been such a thing on Ontario, as there is not, howsoever, or likely to be." "But, Jasper, you have not yet told me how he got command of the schooner." "It's a long story, Mabel, and one your father, the Sergeant, can tell much better than I, for he was present, while I was off on a distant scouting. Jasper is not good at a story, I will own that. I have heard him questioned about this affair, and he never made a good tale of it, though everybody knows it was a good thing. The Scud had near fallen into the hands of the French and the Mingos, when Jasper saved her, in a way which none but a quick-witted mind and a bold heart would have attempted. The Sergeant will tell the tale better than I can, and I wish you to question him some day, when nothing better offers." Mabel determined to ask her father to repeat the incidents of the affair that very night, for it struck her young fancy that nothing better could well offer than to listen to the praises of one who was a bad historian of his own exploits. "Will the Scud remain with us when we reach the island?" she asked, after a little hesitation about the propriety of the question. "Or shall we be left to ourselves?" "That's as may be. Jasper does not often keep the cutter idle when anything is to be done, and we may expect activity on his part. My gifts, however, run so little towards the water and vessels generally, unless it be among rapids and falls and in canoes, that I pretend to know nothing about it. We shall have all right under Jasper, I make no doubt, who can find a trail on Ontario as well as a Delaware can find one on the land." "And our own Delaware, Pathfinder, the Big Serpent, why is he not with us tonight?" "Your question would have been more natural had you said, 'Why are you here, Pathfinder?' The Sarpent is in his place, while I am not in mine. He is out, with 2 or 3 more, scouting the lake shores, and will join us down among the islands, with the tidings he may gather. The Sergeant is too good a soldier to forget his rear while he is facing the enemy in front. It's a thousand pities, Mabel, your father wasn't born a general, as some of the English are who come among us, for I feel sartain he wouldn't leave a Frencher in the Canadas a week, could he have his own way with them." "Shall we have enemies to face in front?" asked Mabel, smiling, and for the first time feeling a slight apprehension about the dangers of the expedition. "Are we likely to have an engagement?" "If we have, Mabel, there will be men enough ready and willing to stand between you and harm. But you are a soldier's daughter, and, we all know, have the spirit of one. Don't let the fear of a battle keep your pretty eyes from sleeping." "I do feel braver out here in the woods, Pathfinder, than I ever felt before amid the weaknesses of the towns, though I have always tried to remember what I owe to my dear father." "Ay, your mother was so before you. You will find Mabel, like her mother, no screamer or a faint-hearted girl to trouble a man in his need, but one who would encourage her mate, and help to keep his heart up when sorest pressed by danger. Said the Sergeant to me, before I ever laid eyes on that sweet countenance of yours. He did." "And why should my father have told you this, Pathfinder?" the girl demanded a little earnestly. "Perhaps he fancied you would think the better of me if you did not believe me a silly coward, as so many of my sex love to make themselves appear." Deception, unless it were at the expense of his enemies in the field, nay, concealment of even a thought, was so little in accordance with the Pathfinder's very nature that he was not a little embarrassed by this simple question. In such a strait he involuntarily took refuge in a middle course, not revealing that which he fancied ought not to be told, nor yet absolutely concealing it. "You must know, Mabel," said he, "that the Sergeant and I are old friends, and have stood side by side, or, if not actually side by side, I a little in advance, as became a scout, and your father with his own men, as better suited a soldier of the king, on many a hard fit and bloody day. It's the way of us skirmishers to think little of the fight when the rifle is done cracking, and at night, around our fires or on our marches, we talk of the things we love, just as you young women convarse about your fancies and opinions when you get together to laugh over your ideas. Now it was natural that the Sergeant, having such a daughter as you, should love her better than anything else, and that he should talk of her oftener than of anything else; while I, having neither daughter, nor sister, nor mother, nor kith, nor kin, nor anything but the Delawares to love, I naturally chimed in, as it were, and got to love you, Mabel, before I ever saw you. Yes, I did, just by talking about you so much." "And now you have seen me," returned the smiling girl, whose unmoved and natural manner proved how little she was thinking of anything more than parental or fraternal regard, "you are beginning to see the folly of forming friendships for people before you know anything about them, except by hearsay." "It wasn't friendship, it isn't friendship, Mabel, that I feel for you. I am the friend of the Delawares, and have been so from boyhood; but my feelings for them, or for the best of them, are not the same as those I got from the Sergeant for you, and especially, now that I begin to know you better. I'm sometimes afeared it isn't wholesome for one who is much occupied in a very manly calling, like that of a guide or scout, or a soldier even, to form friendships for women, young women in particular, as they seem to me to lessen the love of enterprise, and to turn the feelings away from their gifts and natural occupations." "You surely do not mean, Pathfinder, that a friendship for a girl like me would make you less bold, and more unwilling to meet the French than you were before?" "Not so, not so. With you in danger, for instance, I fear I might become foolhardy; but before we became so intimate, as I may say, I loved to think of my scoutings, and of my marches and outlyings, and fights, and other adventures. But now my mind cares less about them. I think more of the barracks, and of evenings passed in discourse, of feelings in which there are no wranglings and bloodshed, and of young women, and of their laughs, and their cheerful, soft voices, their pleasant looks, and their winning ways. I sometimes tell the Sergeant that he and his daughter will be the spoiling of one of the best and most experienced scouts on the lines." "Not they, Pathfinder. They will try to make that which is already so excellent perfect. You do not know us, if you think that either wishes to see you in the least changed. Remain as at present the same honest, upright, conscientious, fearless, intelligent, trustworthy guide that you are, and neither my dear father nor myself can ever think of you differently from what we now do." It was too dark for Mabel to note the workings of the countenance of her listener, but her own sweet face was turned towards him, as she spoke with an energy equal to her frankness, in a way to show how little embarrassed were her thoughts, and how sincere were her words. Her countenance was a little flushed, it is true, but it was with earnestness and truth of feeling, though no nerve thrilled, no limb trembled, no pulsation quickened. In short, her manner and appearance were those of a sincere-minded and frank girl, making such a declaration of good-will and regard for one of the other sex as she felt that his services and good qualities merited, without any of the emotion that invariably accompanies the consciousness of an inclination which might lead to softer disclosures. The Pathfinder was too unpractised, however, to enter into distinctions of this kind, and his humble nature was encouraged by the directness and strength of the words he had just heard. Unwilling, if not unable, to say any more, he walked away, and stood leaning on his rifle and looking up at the stars for full 10 minutes in profound silence. In the meanwhile, the interview on the bastion, to which we have already alluded, took place between Lundy and the Sergeant. "Have the men's knapsacks been examined?" demanded Major Duncan, after he had cast his eye at a written report, handed to him by the Sergeant, but which it was too dark to read. "All, your honor, and all are right." "The ammunition? Arms?" "All in order, Major Duncan, and fit for any service." "You have the men named in my own draft, Dunham?" "Without an exception, sir. Better men could not be found in the regiment." "You have need of the best of our men, Sergeant. This experiment has now been tried 3 times, always under one of the ensigns, who have flattered me with success, but have as often failed. After so much preparation and expense, I do not like to abandon the project entirely, but this will be the last effort, and the result will mainly depend on you and on the Pathfinder." "You may count on us both, Major Duncan. The duty you have given us is not above our habits and experience, and I think it will be well done. I know that the Pathfinder will not be wanting." "On that, indeed, it will be safe to rely. He is a most extraordinary man, Dunham, one who has long puzzled me, but who, now that I understand him, commands as much of my respect as any general in his Majesty's service." "I was in hopes, sir, that you would come to look at the proposed marriage with Mabel as a thing I ought to wish and forward." "As for that, Sergeant, time will show," returned Lundy, smiling, though here too the obscurity concealed the nicer shades of expression. "One woman is sometimes more difficult to manage than a whole regiment of men. By the way, you know that your would-be son-in-law, the quartermaster, will be of the party, and I trust you will at least give him an equal chance in the trial for your daughter's smiles." "If respect for his rank, sir, did not cause me to do this, your honor's wish would be sufficient." "I thank you, Sergeant. We have served much together, and ought to value each other in our several stations. Understand me, however, I ask no more for Davy Muir than a clear field and no favor. In love as in war, each man must gain his own victories. Are you certain that the rations have been properly calculated?" "I'll answer for it, Major Duncan; but if they were not, we cannot suffer with 2 such hunters as Pathfinder and the Serpent in company." "That will never do, Dunham," interrupted Lundy sharply, "and it comes of your American birth and American training. No thorough soldier ever relies on anything but his commissary for supplies, and I beg that no part of my regiment may be the first to set an example to the contrary." "You have only to command, Major Duncan, to be obeyed; and yet, if I might presume, sir—" "Speak freely, Sergeant. You are talking with a friend." "I was merely about to say that I find even the Scotch soldiers like venison and birds quite as well as pork, when they are difficult to be had." "That may be very true, but likes and dislikes have nothing to do with system. An army can rely on nothing but its commissaries. The irregularity of the provincials has played the devil with the king's service too often to be winked at any longer." "General Braddock, your honor, might have been advised by Colonel Washington." "Out upon your Washington! You're all provincials together, man, and uphold each other as if you were of a sworn confederacy." "I believe his Majesty has no more loyal subjects than the Americans, your honor." "In that, Dunham, I'm thinking you're right, and I have been a little too warm, perhaps. I do not consider you a provincial, however, Sergeant, for though born in America, a better soldier never shouldered a musket." "And Colonel Washington, your honor?" "Well, and Colonel Washington may be a useful subject, too. He is the American prodigy, and I suppose I may as well give him all the credit you ask. You have no doubt of the skill of this Jasper Eau douce." "The boy has been tried, sir, and found equal to all that can be required of him." "He has a French name, and has passed much of his boyhood in the French colonies. Has he French blood in his veins, Sergeant?" "Not a drop, your honor. Jasper's father was an old comrade of my own, and his mother came of an honest and loyal family in this very province." "How came he, then, so much among the French, and whence his name? He speaks the language of the Canadas, too, I find." "That is easily explained, Major Duncan. The boy was left under the care of one of our mariners in the old war, and he took to the water like a duck. Your honor knows that we have no ports on Ontario that can be named as such, and he naturally passed most of his time on the other side of the lake, where the French have had a few vessels these 50 years. He learned to speak their language as a matter of course, and got his name from the Indians and Canadians, who are fond of calling men by their qualities, as it might be." "A French master is but a poor instructor for a British sailor, notwithstanding." "I beg your pardon, sir. Jasper Eau douce was brought up under a real English seaman, one that had sailed under the king's pennant, and may be called a thoroughbred; that is to say, a subject born in the colonies, but none the worse at his trade, I hope, Major Duncan, for that." "Perhaps not, Sergeant, perhaps not, nor any better. This Jasper behaved well, too, when I gave him the command of the Scud. No lad could have conducted himself more loyally or better." "Or more bravely, Major Duncan. I am sorry to see, sir, that you have doubts as to the fidelity of Jasper." "It is the duty of the soldier who is entrusted with the care of a distant and important post like this, Dunham, never to relax in his vigilance. We have two of the most artful enemies that the world has ever produced, in their several ways, to contend with, the Indians and the French, and nothing should be overlooked that can lead to injury." "I hope your honor considers me fit to be entrusted with any particular reason that may exist for doubting Jasper, since you have seen fit to entrust me with this command." "It is not that I doubt you, Dunham, that I hesitate to reveal all I may happen to know, but from a strong reluctance to circulate an evil report concerning one of whom I have hitherto thought well. You must think well of the Pathfinder, or you would not wish to give him your daughter?" "For the Pathfinder's honesty, I will answer with my life, sir," returned the Sergeant firmly, and not without a dignity of manner that struck his superior. "Such a man doesn't know how to be false." "I believe you are right, Dunham, and yet this last information has unsettled all my old opinions. I have received an anonymous communication, Sergeant, advising me to be on my guard against Jasper Western, or Jasper Eau douce, as he is called, who, it alleges, has been bought by the enemy, and giving me reason to expect that further and more precise information will soon be sent." "Letters without signatures to them, sir, are scarcely to be regarded in war." "Or in peace, Dunham. No one can entertain a lower opinion of the writer of an anonymous letter, in ordinary matters, than myself. The very act denotes cowardice, meanness, and baseness, and it usually is a token of falsehood, as well as of other vices. But in matters of war, it is not exactly the same thing. Besides, several suspicious circumstances have been pointed out to me." "Such as is fit for an orderly to hear, your honor?" "Certainly; one in whom I confide as much as in yourself, Dunham. It is said, for instance, that your daughter and her party were permitted to escape the Iroquois when they came in, merely to give Jasper credit with me. I am told that the gentry at Frontenac will care more for the capture of the Scud, with Sergeant Dunham and a party of men, together with the defeat of our favorite plan, than for the capture of a girl and the scalp of her uncle." "I understand the hint, sir, but I do not give it credit. Jasper can hardly be true, and Pathfinder false; and as for the last, I would as soon distrust your honor as distrust him." "It would seem so, Sergeant, it would indeed seem so. But Jasper is not the Pathfinder, after all, and I will own, Dunham, I should put more faith in the lad if he didn't speak French." "It's no recommendation in my eyes, I assure your honor; but the boy learned it by compulsion, as it were, and ought not to be condemned too hastily for the circumstance, by your honor's leave." "It's a damned lingo, and never did any one good. At least no British subject, for I suppose the French themselves must talk together in some language or other. I should have much more faith in this Jasper, did he know nothing of their language. This letter has made me uneasy, and were there another to whom I could trust the cutter, I would devise some means to detain him here. I have spoken to you already of a brother-in-law who goes with you, Sergeant, and who is a sailor?" "A real seafaring man, your honor, and somewhat prejudiced against fresh water. I doubt if he could be induced to risk his character on a lake, and I'm certain he never could find the station." "The last is probably true; and then, the man cannot know enough of this treacherous lake to be fit for the employment. You will have to be doubly vigilant, Dunham. I give you full powers, and should you detect this Jasper in any treachery, make him a sacrifice at once to offended justice." "Being in the service of the crown, your honor, he is amenable to martial law." "Very true. Then iron him from his head to his heels, and send him up here in his own cutter. That brother-in-law of yours must be able to find his way back, after he has once travelled the road." "I make no doubt, Major Duncan, we shall be able to do all that will be necessary, should Jasper turn out as you seem to anticipate, although I think I would risk my life on his truth." "I like your confidence. It speaks well for the fellow; but that infernal letter! There is such an air of truth about it; nay, there is so much truth in it, touching other matters." "I think your honor said it wanted the name at the bottom, a great omission for an honest man to make." "Quite right, Dunham; and no one but a rascal, and a cowardly rascal in the bargain, would write an anonymous letter on private affairs. It is different, however, in war. Dispatches are feigned, and artifice is generally allowed to be justifiable." "Military, manly artifices, sir, if you will, such as ambushes, surprises, feints, false attacks, and even spies; but I never heard of a true soldier who could wish to undermine the character of an honest young man by such means as these." "I have met with many strange events, and some stranger people, in the course of my experience. But fare you well, Sergeant. I must detain you no longer. You are now on your guard, and I recommend to you untiring vigilance. I think Muir means shortly to retire; and, should you fully succeed in this enterprise, my influence will not be wanting in endeavoring to put you in the vacancy, to which you have many claims." "I humbly thank your honor," who had been encouraged in this manner any time for the 20 preceding years, "and hope I shall never disgrace my station, whatever it may be. I am what nature and Providence have made me, and hope I'm satisfied." "You have not forgotten the howitzer?" "Jasper took it on board this morning, sir." "Be wary, and do not trust that man unnecessarily. Make a confidant of Pathfinder at once. He may be of service in detecting any villainy that may be stirring. His simple honesty will favor his observation by concealing it. He must be true." "For him, sir, my own head shall answer, and even my rank in the regiment. I have seen him too often tried to doubt him." "Of all wretched sensations, Dunham, distrust, where one is compelled to confide, is the most painful. You have bethought you of the spare flints?" "A sergeant is a safe commander for all such details, your honor." "Well, then give me your hand, Dunham. God bless you! and may you be successful. Muir means to retire. By the way, let the man have an equal chance with your daughter, for it may facilitate future operations about the promotion. One would retire more cheerfully with such a companion as Mabel, than in cheerless widowhood, and with nothing but oneself to love. And such a self, too, as Davy's." "I hope, sir, my child will make a prudent choice, and I think her mind is already pretty much made up in favor of Pathfinder. Still she must have fair play, though disobedience is the next crime to mutiny." "Have all the ammunition carefully examined and dried as soon as you arrive. The damp of the lake may affect it. And now, once more, farewell, Sergeant. Beware of that Jasper, and consult with Muir in any difficulty. I shall expect you to return triumphant this day month." "God bless your honor. If anything should happen to me, I trust to you, Major Duncan, to care for an old soldier's character." "Rely on me, Dunham. You will rely on a friend. Be vigilant. Remember you will be in the very jaws of the lion. Pshaw! Of no lion neither, but of treacherous tigers, in their very jaws, and beyond support. Have the flints counted and examined in the morning. And farewell, Dunham, farewell." The Sergeant took the extended hand of his superior with proper respect, and they finally parted, Lundy hastening into his own movable abode, while the other left the fort, descended to the beach, and got into a boat. It is not to be supposed that Sergeant Dunham, after he had parted from his commanding officer, was likely to forget the injunctions he had received. He thought highly of Jasper in general, but distrust had been insinuated between his former confidence and the obligations of duty; and as he now felt that everything depended on his own vigilance, by the time the boat reached the side of the Scud he was in a proper humor to let no suspicious circumstance go unheeded, or any unusual movement of the young sailor pass without its comment. As a matter of course, he viewed things in the light suited to his peculiar mood, and his precautions, as well as his distrust, partook of the habits, opinions, and education of the man. The Scud's kedge was lifted as soon as the boat with the Sergeant, who was the last person expected, was seen to quit the shore, and the head of the cutter was cast to the eastward by means of the sweeps. A few vigorous strokes of the latter, in which the soldiers aided, now sent the light craft into the line or the current that flowed from the river, when she was suffered to drift into the offing again. As yet there was no wind, the light and almost imperceptible air from the lake, that had existed previously to the setting of the sun, having entirely failed. All this time an unusual quiet prevailed in the cutter. It appeared as if those on board of her felt they were entering upon an uncertain enterprise, in the obscurity of night, and that their duty, the hour, and the manner of their departure lent a solemnity to their movements. Discipline also came in aid of these feelings. Most were silent, and those who did speak, spoke seldom and in low voices. In this manner the cutter set slowly out into the lake, until she had got as far as the river current would carry her, when she became stationary, waiting for the usual land breeze. An interval of half an hour followed, during the whole of which time the Scud lay as motionless as a log floating on the water. While the little changes just mentioned were occurring in the situation of the vessel, notwithstanding the general quiet that prevailed, all conversation had not been repressed, for Sergeant Dunham, having first ascertained that both his daughter and her female companion were on the quarter-deck, led the Pathfinder to the after cabin, where, closing the door with great caution, and otherwise making certain that he was beyond the reach of eavesdroppers, he commenced as follows. "It is now many years, my friend, since you began to experience the hardships and dangers of the woods in my company." "It is, Sergeant; yes, it is. I sometimes fear I am too old for Mabel, who was not born until you and I had fought the Frenchers as comrades." "No fear on that account, Pathfinder. I was near your age before I prevailed on the mind of her mother, and Mabel is a steady, thoughtful girl, one that will regard character more than anything else. A lad like Jasper Eau douce, for instance, will have no chance with her, though he is both young and comely." "Does Jasper think of marrying?" inquired the guide, simply but earnestly. "I should hope not; at least, not until he has satisfied every one of his fitness to possess a wife." "Jasper is a gallant boy, and one of great gifts in his way. He may claim a wife as well as another." "To be frank with you, Pathfinder, I brought you here to talk about this very youngster. Major Duncan has received some information which has led him to suspect that Eau douce is false, and in the pay of the enemy. I wish to hear your opinion on the subject." "Anan?" "I say, the Major suspects Jasper of being a traitor, a French spy, or what is worse, of being bought to betray us. He has received a letter to this effect, and has been charging me to keep an eye on the boy's movements, for he fears we shall meet with enemies when we least suspect it, and by his means." "Duncan of Lundie has told you this, Sergeant Dunham?" "He has indeed, Pathfinder; and though I have been loath to believe anything to the injury of Jasper, I have a feeling which tells me I ought to distrust him. Do you believe in presentiments, my friend?" "In what, Sergeant?" "Presentiments, a sort of secret foreknowledge of events that are about to happen. The Scotch of our regiment are great sticklers for such things, and my opinion of Jasper is changing so fast that I begin to fear that there must be some truth in their doctrines." "But you've been talking with Duncan of Lundie concerning Jasper, and his words have raised misgivings." "Not it, not so in the least; for while conversing with the Major, my feelings were altogether the other way, and I endeavored to convince him all I could that he did the boy injustice. But there is no use in holding out against a presentiment, I find, and I fear there is something in the suspicion after all." "I know nothing of presentiments, Sergeant, but I have known Jasper Eau douce since he was a boy, and I have as much faith in his honesty as I have in my own, or that of the Sarpent himself." "But the Serpent, Pathfinder, has his tricks and ambushes in war as well as another." "Ay, them are his natural gifts, and are such as belong to his people. Neither redskin nor paleface can deny nature, but Chingachgook is not a man to feel a presentiment against." "That I believe, nor should I have thought ill of Jasper this very morning. It seems to me, Pathfinder, since I've taken up this presentiment, that the lad does not bustle about his deck naturally, as he used to do, but that he is silent and moody and thoughtful, like a man who has a load on his conscience." "Jasper is never noisy, and he tells me noisy ships are generally ill-worked ships. Master Cap agrees in this too. No, I will believe naught against Jasper until I see it. Send for your brother, Sergeant, and let us question him in this matter, for to sleep with distrust of one's friend in the heart is like sleeping with lead there. I have no faith in your presentiments." The Sergeant, although he scarcely knew himself with what object, complied, and Cap was summoned to join the consultation. As Pathfinder was more collected than his companion, and felt so strong a conviction of the good faith of the party accused, he assumed the office of spokesman. "We have asked you to come down, Master Cap," he commenced, "in order to inquire if you have remarked anything out of the common way in the movements of Eau douce this evening." "His movements are common enough, I daresay, for fresh water, Master Pathfinder, though we should think most of his proceedings irregular down on the coast." Yes, we know you will never agree with the lad about the manner the cutter ought to be managed, but it is on another point we wish your opinion." The Pathfinder then explained to Cap the nature of the suspicions which the Sergeant entertained, and the reasons why they had been excited, so far as the latter had been communicated by Major Duncan. "The youngster talks French, does he?" said Cap. "They say he speaks it better than common," returned the Sergeant gravely. "Pathfinder knows this to be true." "I'll not gainsay it," answered the guide. "At least, they tell me such is the fact, but this would prove nothing ag'in the Mississauga, and least of all ag'in one like Jasper. I speak the Mingo dialect myself, having learnt it while a prisoner among the reptiles. But who will say I am their friend? Not that I am an enemy, either, according to Indian notions, though I am their enemy, I will admit, agreeable to Christianity." "Ay, Pathfinder, but Jasper did not get his French as a prisoner. He took it in his boyhood, when the mind is easily impressed, and gets its permanent notions, when nature has a presentiment, as it were, which way the character is likely to incline." "A very just remark," added Cap; "for that is the time of life when we all learn the catechism and other moral improvements. The Sergeant's observation shows that he understands human nature, and I agree with him perfectly. It is a damnable thing for a youngster, up here, on this bit of fresh water, to talk French. If it were down on the Atlantic, now, where a seafaring man has occasion sometimes to converse with a pilot or a linguister in that language, I should not think so much of it, though we always look with suspicion even there at a shipmate who knows too much of the tongue. But up here, on Ontario, I hold it to be a most suspicious circumstance." "But Jasper must talk in French to the people on the other shore," said Pathfinder, "or hold his tongue, as there are none but French to speak to." "You don't mean to tell me, Pathfinder, that France lies hereaway on the opposite coast?" cried Cap, jerking a thumb over his shoulder in the direction of the Canadas. "That one side of this bit of fresh water is York and the other France?" "I mean to tell you this is York, and that is Upper Canada, and that English and Dutch and Indian are spoken in the first, and French and Indian in the last. Even the Mingos have got many of the French words in their dialect, and it is no improvement neither." "Very true. And what sort of people are the Mingos, my friend?" inquired the Sergeant, touching the other on his shoulder, by way of enforcing a remark, the inherent truth of which sensibly increased its value in the eyes of the speaker. "No one knows them better than yourself, and I ask you, what sort of a tribe are they?" "Jasper is no Mingo, Sergeant." "He speaks French, and he might as well be in that particular. Brother Cap, can you recollect no movement of this unfortunate young man, in the way of his calling, that would seem to denote treachery?" "Not distinctly, Sergeant, though he has gone to work wrong end foremost half his time. It's true that one of his hands coiled a rope against the sun, and he called it quirling a rope, too, when I asked him what he was about; but I am not certain that anything was meant by it, though, I dare say, the French coil half their running rigging the wrong way, and may call it quirling it down, too, for that matter. Then Jasper himself belayed the end of the jib halyards to a stretcher in the rigging, instead of bringing it to the mast, where they belong, at least among British sailors." "I dare say Jasper may have got some Canada notions about working his craft, from being so much on the other side," Pathfinder interposed. "But catching an idea, or a word, isn't treachery and bad faith. I sometimes get an idea from the Mingos themselves, but my heart has always been with the Delawares. No, Jasper is true, and the king might trust him with his crown, just as he would trust his eldest son, who, as he is to wear it one day, ought to be the last man to wish to steal it." "Fine talking, said Cap. "All fine talking, Master Pathfinder, but damn little logic. In the first place, the king's majesty cannot lend his crown, it being contrary to the laws of the realm, which require him to wear it at all times, in order that his sacred person may be known, just as the silver oar is necessary to a sheriff's officer afloat. In the next place, it's high treason, by law, for the eldest son of his majesty ever to covet the crown, or to have a child, except in lawful wedlock, as either would derange the succession. Thus you see, friend Pathfinder, that in order to reason truly one must get under way, as it might be, on the right tack. Law is reason, and reason is philosophy, and philosophy is a steady drag. Whence it follows that crowns are regulated by law, reason, and philosophy." I know little of all this, Master Cap, but nothing short of seeing and feeling will make me think Jasper Western a traitor." "There you are wrong again, Pathfinder, for there is a way of proving a thing much more conclusively than either seeing or feeling, or by both together, and that is by a circumstance." "It may be so in the settlements, but it is not so here on the lines." "It is so in nature, which is monarch over all. There was a circumstance, just after we came on board this evening, that is extremely suspicious, and which may be set down at once as a make-weight against this lad. Jasper bent on the king's ensign with his own hands, and, while he pretended to be looking at Mabel and the soldier's wife, giving directions about showing them below here and that, he got the flag Union down." "That might have been an accident," returned the sergeant, "for such a thing has happened to myself. Besides, the halyards lead to a pulley, and the flag would have come right, or not, according to the manner in which the lad hoisted it." "A pulley!" exclaimed Cap, with strong disgust. "I wish, Sergeant Dunham, I could prevail on you to use proper terms. An ensign halyard block is no more a pulley than your halberd is a boarding pike. It is true that by hoisting on one part, another part would go uppermost; but I look upon that affair of the ensign, now you have mentioned your suspicions, as a circumstance, and shall bear it in mind. I trust supper is not to be overlooked, however, even if we have a hold full of traitors." "It will be duly attended to, brother Cap. But I shall count on you for aid in managing the Scud, should anything occur to induce me to arrest Jasper." "I'll not fail you, Sergeant; and in such an event you'll probably learn what this cutter can really perform, for, as yet, I fancy it's pretty much matter of guesswork." "Well, for my part," said Pathfinder, drawing a heavy sigh, "I shall cling to the hope of Jasper's innocence, and recommend plain dealing, by asking the lad himself, without further delay, whether he is or is not a traitor. I'll put Jasper Western against all presentiments and circumstances in the colony." "That will never do," rejoined the sergeant. "The responsibility of this affair rests with me, and I request and enjoin that nothing be said to any one without my knowledge. We will all keep watchful eyes about us, and take proper note of circumstances." "Ay, ay, circumstances are the things after all," returned Cap. "One circumstance is worth 50 facts. That I know to be the law of the realm. Many a man has been hanged on circumstances." The conversation now ceased, and after a short delay, the whole party returned to the deck, each individual disposed to view the conduct of the suspected Jasper in the manner most suited to his own habits and character. End of chapter. Chapter 14 of the Pathfinder. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. This recording is by Mark Smith of Simpsonville, South Carolina. The Pathfinder, by James Fenimore Cooper. Chapter 14. Even such a man, so faint, so spiritless, so dull, so dead in look, so woe-begone, drew Priam's curtain in the dead of night, and would have told him half his Troy was burned. Attributed to Shakespeare. All this time matters were elsewhere passing in their usual train. Jasper, like the weather and his vessel, seemed to be waiting for the land breeze, while the soldiers, accustomed to early rising, had, to a man, sought their pallets in the main hold. None remained on deck but the people of the cutter, Mr. Muir, and the two females. The quartermaster was endeavoring to render himself agreeable to Mabel, while our heroine herself, little affected by his assiduities, which she ascribed partly to the habitual gallantry of a soldier, and partly, perhaps, to her own pretty face, was enjoying the peculiarities of a scene and situation which, to her, were full of the charms of novelty. The sails had been hoisted, but as yet not a breath of air was in motion, and so still and placid was the lake that not the smallest motion was perceptible in the cutter. She had drifted in the river current to a distance a little exceeding a quarter of a mile from the land, and there she lay, beautiful in her symmetry and form, but like a fixture. Young Jasper was on the quarter-deck, near enough to hear occasionally the conversation which passed, but too diffident of his own claim, and too intent on his duties, to attempt to mingle in it. The fine blue eyes of Mabel followed his motions in curious expectation, and more than once the quartermaster had to repeat his compliments before she heard them, so intent was she on the little occurrences of the vessel, and, we might add, so indifferent to the eloquence of her companion. At length even Mr. Muir became silent, and there was a deep stillness on the water. Presently an oar blade fell in a boat beneath the fort, and the sound reached the cutter as distinctly as if it had been produced on her deck. Then came a murmur like a sigh of the night, a fluttering of the canvas, the creaking of the boom, and the flap of the jib. These well-known sounds were followed by a slight heel in the cutter, and by the bellying of all the sails. "Here's the wind, Anderson," called out Jasper to the oldest of his sailors. "Take the helm." This brief order was obeyed, the helm was put up, the cutter's bows fell off, and in a few minutes the water was heard murmuring under her head, as the Scud glanced through the lake at the rate of 5 miles in the hour. All this passed in profound silence, when Jasper again gave the order to "ease off the sheets a little, and keep her along the land." It was at this instant that the party from the after cabin reappeared on the quarter-deck. "You've no inclination, Jasper lad, to trust yourself too near our neighbours the French," observed Muir, who took that occasion to recommence the discourse. "Well, well, your prudence will never be questioned by me, for I like the Canadas as little as you can possibly like them yourself." "I hug this shore, Mr. Muir, on account of the wind. The land breeze is always freshest close in, provided you are not so near as to make a lee of the trees. We have Mexico Bay to cross, and that, on the present course, will give us quite offing enough." "I'm right glad it's not the Bay of Mexico," put in Cap, "which is a part of the world I would rather not visit in one of your inland craft. Does your cutter bear a weather helm, Master Eau douce?" "She is as easy on her rudder, Master Cap, but likes looking up at the breeze as well as another, when in lively motion." "I suppose you have such things as reefs, though you can hardly have occasion to use them." Mabel's bright eye detected the smile that gleamed for an instant on Jasper's handsome face, but no one else saw that momentary exhibition of surprise and contempt. "We have reefs, and often have occasion to use them," quietly returned the young man. "Before we get in, Master Cap, an opportunity may offer to show you the manner in which we do so, for there is easterly weather brewing, and the wind cannot chop, even on the ocean itself, more readily than it flies round on Lake Ontario." "So much for knowing no better. I have seen the wind in the Atlantic fly round like a coach wheel, in a way to keep your sails shaking for an hour, and the ship would become perfectly motionless from not knowing which way to turn." "We have no such sudden changes here, certainly," Jasper mildly answered, "though we think ourselves liable to unexpected shifts of wind. I hope, however, to carry this land breeze as far as the first islands, after which there will be less danger of our being seen and followed by any of the lookout boats from Frontenac." "Do you think the French keep spies out on the broad lake, Jasper?" inquired the Pathfinder. "We know they do. One was off Oswego during the night of Monday last. A bark canoe came close in with the eastern point, and landed an Indian and an officer. Had you been outlying that night, as usual, we should have secured one, if not both of them." It was too dark to betray the color that deepened on the weather-burnt features of the guide, for he felt the consciousness of having lingered in the fort that night, listening to the sweet tones of Mabel's voice as she sang ballads to her father, and gazing at the countenance which, to him, was radiant with charms. Probity in thought, indeed, being the distinguishing quality of this extraordinary man's mind, while he felt that a sort of disgrace ought to attach to his idleness on the occasion mentioned, the last thought that could occur would be to attempt to palliate or deny his negligence. "I confess it, Jasper, I confess it," said he humbly. "Had I been out that night, and I now recollect no sufficient reason why I was not, it might indeed have turned out as you say." "It was the evening you passed with us, Pathfinder," Mabel innocently remarked. "Surely one who lives so much of his time in the forest, in front of the enemy, may be excused for giving a few hours of his time to an old friend and his daughter?" "Nay, nay, I've done little else but idle since we reached the garrison," returned the other, sighing; "and it is well that the lad should tell me of it. The idler needs a rebuke. Yes, he needs a rebuke." "Rebuke, Pathfinder! I never dreamt of saying anything disagreeable, and least of all would think of rebuking you, because a solitary spy and an Indian or two have escaped us. Now I know where you were, I think your absence the most natural thing in the world." "I think nothing of what you said, Jasper, since it was deserved. We are all human, and all do wrong."
"This is unkind, Pathfinder."
"Give me your hand, lad, give me your hand. It wasn't you that gave the lesson. It was conscience." "Well, well," interrupted Cap, "now this latter matter is settled to the satisfaction of all parties, perhaps you will tell us how it happened to be known that there were spies near us so lately. This looks amazingly like a circumstance." As the mariner uttered the last sentence, he pressed a foot slyly on that of the Sergeant, and nudged the guide with his elbow, winking at the same time, though this sign was lost in the obscurity.
"It is known because their trail was found next day by the Serpent, and it was that of a military boot and a moccasin. One of our hunters, moreover, saw the canoe crossing towards Frontenac next morning."
"Did the trail lead near the garrison, Jasper?" Pathfinder asked in a manner so meek and subdued that it resembled the tone of a rebuked schoolboy. "Did the trail lead near the garrison, lad?"
"We thought not, though, of course, it did not cross the river. It was followed down to the eastern point, at the river's mouth, where what was doing in port might be seen, but it did not cross, as we could discover."
"And why didn't you get under way, Master Jasper," Cap demanded, "and give chase? On Tuesday morning it blew a good breeze, one in which this cutter might have run 9 knots." "That may do on the ocean, Master Cap," put in Pathfinder, "but it would not do here. Water leaves no trail, and a Mingo and a Frenchman are a match for the devil in a pursuit." "Who wants a trail when the chase can be seen from the deck, as Jasper here said was the case with this canoe? And it mattered nothing if there were 20 of your Mingos and Frenchmen, with a good English-built bottom in their wake. I'll engage, Master Eau douce, had you given me a call that said Tuesday morning, that we should have overhauled the blackguards."
"I dare say, Master Cap, that the advice of as old a seaman as you might have done no harm to as young a sailor as myself, but it is a long and hopeless chase that has a bark canoe in it."
"You would have only had to press it hard to drive it ashore."
"Ashore, Master Cap? You do not understand our lake navigation at all, if you suppose it is an easy matter to force a bark canoe ashore. As soon as they find themselves pressed, these bubbles paddle right into the wind's eye, and before you know it, you find yourself a mile or two dead under their lee."
"You don't wish me to believe, Master Jasper, that any one is so heedless of drowning as to put off into this lake in one of them eggshells when there is any wind?"
"I have often crossed Ontario in a bark canoe, even when there has been a good deal of sea on. Well managed, they are the driest boats of which we have any knowledge." Cap now led his brother-in-law and Pathfinder aside, when he assured him that the admission of Jasper concerning the spies was a circumstance, and a strong circumstance, and as such it deserved his deliberate investigation, while his account of the canoes was so improbable as to wear the appearance of browbeating the listeners. Jasper spoke confidently of the character of the two individuals who had landed, and this Cap deemed pretty strong proof that he knew more about them than was to be gathered from a mere trail. As for moccasins, he said that they were worn in that part of the world by white men as well as by Indians. He had purchased a pair himself, and boots, it was notorious, did not particularly make a soldier. Although much of this logic was thrown away on the Sergeant, still it produced some effect. He thought it a little singular himself that there should have been spies detected so near the fort, and he knew nothing of it, nor did he believe that this was a branch of knowledge that fell particularly within the sphere of Jasper. It was true that the Scud had, once or twice, been sent across the lake to land men of this character, or to bring them off; but then the part played by Jasper, to his own certain knowledge, was very secondary, the master of the cutter remaining as ignorant as any one else of the purport of the visits of those who had been carried to and fro, nor did he see why he alone, of all present, should know anything of the late visit. Pathfinder viewed the matter differently. With his habitual diffidence, he reproached himself with a neglect of duty, and that knowledge, of which the want struck him as a fault in one whose business it was to possess it, appeared a merit in the young man. He saw nothing extraordinary in Jasper's knowing the facts he had related, while he did feel it was unusual, not to say disgraceful, that he himself now heard of them for the first time. "As for moccasins, Master Cap," said he, when a short pause invited him to speak, "they may be worn by pale faces as well as by redskins, it is true, though they never leave the same trail on the foot of one as on the foot of the other. Any one who is used to the woods can tell the footstep of an Indian from the footstep of a white man, whether it be made by a boot or a moccasin. It will need better evidence than this to persuade me into the belief that Jasper is false." "You will allow, Pathfinder, that there are such things in the world as traitors?" put in Cap logically. "I never knew an honest-minded Mingo, one that you could put faith in, if he had a temptation to deceive you. Cheating seems to be their gift, and I sometimes think they ought to be pitied for it rather than persecuted." "Then why not believe that this Jasper may have the same weakness? A man is a man, and human nature is sometimes but a poor concern, as I know by experience." This was the opening of another long and desultory conversation, in which the probability of Jasper's guilt or innocence was argued, pro and con, until both the Sergeant and his brother-in-law had nearly reasoned themselves into settled convictions in favor of the first, while their companion grew sturdier and sturdier in his defence of the accused, and still more fixed in his opinion of his being unjustly charged with treachery. In this there was nothing out of the common course of things, for there is no more certain way of arriving at any particular notion than by undertaking to defend it, and among the most obstinate of our opinions may be classed those which are derived from discussions in which we affect to search for truth, while in reality we are only fortifying prejudice. By this time the Sergeant had reached a state of mind that disposed him to view every act of the young sailor with distrust, and he soon got to coincide with his relative in deeming the peculiar knowledge of Jasper, in reference to the spies, a branch of information that certainly did not come within the circle of his regular duties, as a circumstance. While this matter was thus discussed near the taffrail, Mabel sat silently by the companion-way, Mr. Muir having gone below to look after his personal comforts, and Jasper standing a little aloof, with his arms crossed and his eyes wandering from the sails to the clouds, from the clouds to the dusky outline of the shore, from the shore to the lake, and from the lake back again to the sails. Our heroine, too, began to commune with her own thoughts. The excitement of the late journey, the incidents which marked the day of her arrival at the fort, the meeting with a father who was virtually a stranger to her, the novelty of her late situation in the garrison, and her present voyage, formed a vista for the mind's eye to look back through, which seemed lengthened into months. She could with difficulty believe that she had so recently left the town, with all the usages of civilized life, and she wondered in particular that the incidents which had occurred during the descent of the Oswego had made so little impression on her mind. Too inexperienced to know that events, when crowded, have the effect of time, or that the quick succession of novelties that pass before us in travelling elevates objects, in a measure, to the dignity of events, she drew upon her memory for days and dates, in order to make certain that she had known Jasper, and the Pathfinder, and her own father, but little more than a fortnight. Mabel was a girl of heart rather than of imagination, though by no means deficient in the last, and she could not easily account for the strength of her feelings in connection with those who were so lately strangers to her, for she was not sufficiently accustomed to analyze her sensations to understand the nature of the influences that have just been mentioned. As yet, however, her pure mind was free from the blight of distrust, and she had no suspicion of the views of either of her suitors, and one of the last thoughts that could have voluntarily disturbed her confidence would have been to suppose it possible either of her companions was a traitor to his king and country. America, at the time of which we are writing, was remarkable for its attachment to the German family that then sat on the British throne; for, as is the fact with all provinces, the virtues and qualities that are proclaimed near the centre of power, as incense and policy, get to be a part of political faith with the credulous and ignorant at a distance. This truth is just as apparent today in connection with the prodigies of the Republic, as it then was in connection with those distant rulers whose merits it was always safe to applaud, and whose demerits it was treason to reveal. It is a consequence of this mental dependence that public opinion is so much placed at the mercy of the designing, and the world, in the midst of its idle boasts of knowledge and improvement, is left to receive its truths, on all such points as touch the interests of the powerful and managing, through such a medium, and such a medium only, as may serve the particular views of those who pull the wires. Pressed upon by the subjects of France, who were then encircling the British colonies with a belt of forts and settlements that completely secured the savages for allies, it would have been difficult to say whether the Americans loved the English more than they hated the French, and those who then lived probably would have considered the alliance which took place between the cis-Atlantic subjects and the ancient rivals of the British crown, some 20 years later, as an event entirely without the circle of probabilities. Disaffection was a rare offence, and most of all would treason, that should favor France or Frenchmen, have been odious in the eyes of the provincials. The last thing that Mabel would suspect of Jasper was the very crime with which he now stood secretly charged; and if others near her endured the pains of distrust, she, at least, was filled with the generous confidence of a woman. As yet no whisper had reached her ear to disturb the feeling of reliance with which she had early regarded the young sailor, and her own mind would have been the last to suggest such a thought of itself. The pictures of the past and of the present, therefore, that exhibited themselves so rapidly to her active imagination, were unclouded with a shade that might affect any in whom she felt an interest; and ere she had mused, in the matter related, a quarter of an hour, the whole scene around her was filled with unalloyed satisfaction. The season and the night, to represent them truly, were of a nature to stimulate the sensations which youth, health, and happiness are wont to associate with novelty. The weather was warm, as is not always the case in that region even in summer, while the air that came off the land, in breathing currents, brought with it the coolness and fragrance of the forest. The wind was far from being fresh, though there was enough of it to drive the Scud merrily ahead, and, perhaps, to keep attention alive, in the uncertainty that more or less accompanies darkness. Jasper, however, appeared to regard it with complacency, as was apparent by what he said in a short dialogue that now occurred between him and Mabel. At this rate, Eau douce, for so Mabel had already learned to style the young sailor, said our heroine, we cannot be long in reaching our place of destination. Has your father been told what that is, Mabel? He has told me nothing. My father is too much of a soldier, and too little used to have a family around him, to talk of such matters. Is it forbidden to say whither we are bound? It cannot be far, while we steer in this direction, for 60 or 70 miles will take us into the St. Lawrence, which the French might make too hot for us, and no voyage on this lake can be very long. So says my Uncle Cap. But to me, Jasper, Ontario and the ocean appear very much the same. You have then been on the ocean, while I, who pretend to be a sailor, have never yet seen salt water. You must have a great contempt for such a mariner as myself in your heart, Mabel Dunham. Then I have no such thing in my heart, Jasper Eau douce. What right have I, a girl without experience or knowledge, to despise any, much less one like you, who are trusted by the Major, and who command a vessel like this? I have never been on the ocean, though I have seen it, and, I repeat, I see no difference between this lake and the Atlantic. Nor in them that sail on both? I was afraid, Mabel, your uncle had said so much against us freshwater sailors, that you had begun to look upon us as little better than pretenders. Give yourself no uneasiness on that account, Jasper, for I know my uncle, and he says as many things against those who live ashore, when at York, as he now says against those who sail on fresh water. No, neither my father nor myself think anything of such opinions. My Uncle Cap, if he spoke openly, would be found to have even a worse notion of a soldier than of a sailor who never saw the sea. But your father, Mabel, has a better opinion of soldiers than of any one else? He wishes you to be the wife of a soldier? Jasper Eau douce, I the wife of a soldier! My father wishes it. Ah, why should he wish any such thing? What soldier is there in the garrison that I could marry, that he could wish me to marry? One may love a calling so well as to fancy it will cover 1,000 imperfections. But one is not likely to love his own calling so well as to cause him to overlook everything else. You say my father wishes me to marry a soldier, and yet there is no soldier at Oswego that he would be likely to give me to. I am in an awkward position, for while I am not good enough to be the wife of one of the gentlemen of the garrison, I think even you will admit, Jasper, I am too good to be the wife of one of the common soldiers. As Mabel spoke thus frankly, she blushed, she knew not why, though the obscurity concealed the fact from her companion, and she laughed faintly, like one who felt that the subject, however embarrassing it might be, deserved to be treated fairly. Jasper, it would seem, viewed her position differently from herself. It is true, Mabel, said he, you are not what is called a lady, in the common meaning of the word. Not in any meaning, Jasper, the generous girl eagerly interrupted. On that head I have no vanities, I hope. Providence has made me the daughter of a sergeant, and I am content to remain in the station to which I was born. But all do not remain in the stations in which they were born, Mabel, for some rise above them, and some fall below them. Many sergeants have become officers, even generals, and why may not sergeants' daughters become officers' ladies? In the case of Sergeant Dunham's daughter, I know no better reason than the fact that no officer is likely to wish to make her his wife, returned Mabel, laughing. You may think so, but there are some in the 55th that know better. There is certainly one officer in that regiment, Mabel, who does wish to make you his wife. Quick as the flashing lightning, the rapid thoughts of Mabel Dunham glanced over the 5 or 6 subalterns of the corps, who by age and inclinations would be the most likely to form such a wish, and we should do injustice to her habits, perhaps, were we not to say that a lively sensation of pleasure rose momentarily in her bosom, at the thought of being raised above a station which, Whatever might be her professions of contentment, she felt that she had been too well educated to fill with perfect satisfaction. But this emotion was as transient as it was sudden, for Mabel Dunham was a girl of too much pure and womanly feeling to view the marriage tie through anything so worldly as the mere advantages of station. The passing emotion was a thrill produced by factitious habits, while the more settled opinion which remained was the offspring of nature and principles. "I know no officer in the 55th, or any other regiment, who would be likely to do so foolish a thing, nor do I think I myself would do so foolish a thing as to marry an officer." "Foolish, Mabel!" "Yes, foolish, Jasper. You know, as well as I can know, what the world would think of such matters, and I should be sorry, very sorry, to find that my husband ever regretted that he had so far yielded to a fancy for a face or a figure as to have married the daughter of one so much his inferior as a sergeant." "Your husband, Mabel, will not be so likely to think of the father as to think of the daughter." The girl was talking with spirit, though feeling evidently entered into her part of the discourse; but she paused for nearly a minute after Jasper had made the last observation, before she uttered another word. Then she continued, in a manner less playful, and one critically attentive might have fancied in a manner slightly melancholy. "Parent and child ought so to live as not to have two hearts, or two modes of feeling and thinking. A common interest in all things I should think as necessary to happiness in man and wife, as between the other members of the same family. Most of all, ought neither the man nor the woman to have any unusual cause for unhappiness, the world furnishing so many of itself." "Am I to understand, then, Mabel, you would refuse to marry an officer, merely because he was an officer?" "Have you a right to ask such a question, Jasper?" said Mabel, smiling. "No other right than what a strong desire to see you happy can give, which, after all, may be very little. My anxiety has been increased, from happening to know that it is your father's intention to persuade you to marry Lieutenant Muir." "My dear, dear father can entertain no notion so ridiculous, no notion so cruel." "Would it, then, be cruel to wish you the wife of a quartermaster?" "I have told you what I think on that subject, and cannot make my words stronger. Having answered you so frankly, Jasper, I have a right to ask how you know that my father thinks of any such thing." "That he has chosen a husband for you I know from his own mouth, for he has told me this much during our frequent conversations while he has been superintending the shipment of the stores; and that Mr. Muir is to offer for you I know from the officer himself, who has told me as much. By putting the two things together, I have come to the opinion mentioned." "May not my dear father, Jasper?" Mabel's face glowed like fire while she spoke, though her words escaped her slowly, and by a sort of involuntary impulse. "May not my dear father have been thinking of another? It does not follow, from what you say, that Mr. Muir was in his mind." "Is it not probable, Mabel, from all that has passed? What brings the quartermaster here? He has never found it necessary before to accompany the parties that have gone below. He thinks of you for his wife, and your father has made up his own mind that you shall be so. You must see, Mabel, that Mr. Muir follows you?" Mabel made no answer. Her feminine instinct had, indeed, told her that she was an object of admiration with the quartermaster, though she had hardly supposed to the extent that Jasper believed, and she, too, had even gathered from the discourse of her father that he thought seriously of having her disposed of in marriage; but by no process of reasoning could she ever have arrived at the inference that Mr. Muir was to be the man. She did not believe it now, though she was far from suspecting the truth. Indeed, it was her own opinion that these casual remarks of her father, which had struck her, had proceeded from a general wish to have her settled, rather than any desire to see her united to any particular individual. These thoughts, however, she kept secret, for self-respect and feminine reserve showed her the impropriety of making them the subject of discussion with her present companion. By way of changing the conversation, therefore, after the pause had lasted long enough to be embarrassing to both parties, she said, "Of one thing you may be certain, Jasper, and that is all I wish to say on the subject. Lieutenant Muir, though he were a colonel, will never be the husband of Mabel Dunham. And now, tell me of your voyage. When will it end?" "That is uncertain. Once afloat, we are at the mercy of the winds and waves. Pathfinder will tell you that he who begins to chase the deer in the morning cannot tell where he will sleep at night." "But we are not chasing a deer, nor is it morning, so Pathfinder's moral is thrown away." "Although we are not chasing a deer, we are after that which may be as hard to catch. I can tell you no more than I have said already, for it is our duty to be close-mouthed, whether anything depends on it or not. I'm afraid, however, I shall not keep you long enough in the Scud to show you what she can do at need." "I think a woman unwise who ever marries a sailor," said Mabel abruptly and almost involuntarily. "This is a strange opinion. Why do you hold it?" "Because a sailor's wife is certain to have a rival in his vessel. My uncle Cap, too, says that a sailor should never marry." "He means saltwater sailors," returned Jasper, laughing. "If he thinks wives not good enough for those who sail on the ocean, he will fancy them just suited to those who sail on the lakes. I hope, Mabel, you do not take your opinions of us freshwater mariners from all that Master Cap says."
"Sail ho!"
exclaimed the very individual of whom they were conversing.
"Or boat ho! Would be nearer the truth."
Jasper ran forward, and sure enough a small object was discernible about 100 yards ahead of the cutter and nearly on her lee bow. At the first glance he saw it was a bark canoe, for though the darkness prevented hues from being distinguished, the eye that had become accustomed to the night might discern forms at some little distance, and the eye which, like Jasper's, had long been familiar with things aquatic, could not be at a loss in discovering the outlines necessary to come to the conclusion he did. "This may be an enemy," the young man remarked, "and it may be well to overhaul him." "He is paddling with all his might, lad," observed the Pathfinder, "and means to cross your bows and get to windward, when you might as well chase a full-grown buck on snowshoes." "Let her luff!" cried Jasper to the man at the helm. "Luff up till she shakes! There! Steady, and hold all that!" The helmsman complied, and as the Scud was now dashing the water aside merrily, a minute or two put the canoe so far to leeward as to render escape impracticable. Jasper now sprang to the helm himself, and, by judicious and careful handling, he got so near his chase that it was secured by a boat-hook. On receiving an order, the two persons who were in the canoe left it, and no sooner had they reached the deck of the cutter than they were found to be Arrowhead and his wife. End of chapter. Chapter 15 of the Pathfinder. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. This recording is by Mark Smith of Simpsonville, South Carolina. The Pathfinder, by James Fenimore Cooper. Chapter 15. What pearl is it that rich men cannot buy, that learning is too proud to gather up, but which the poor and the despised of all seek and obtain, and often find unsought? Tell me, and I will tell thee what is truth. Attributed to Cowper. The meeting with the Indian and his wife excited no surprise in the majority of those who witnessed the occurrence, but Mabel, and all who knew of the manner in which this chief had been separated from the party of Cap, simultaneously entertained suspicions, which it was far easier to feel than to follow out by any plausible clue to certainty. Pathfinder, who alone could converse freely with the prisoners, for such they might now be considered, took Arrowhead aside, and held a long conversation with him, concerning the reasons of the latter for having deserted his charge, and the manner in which he had been since employed. The Tuscarora met these inquiries, and he gave his answers with the stoicism of an Indian. As respects the separation, his excuses were very simply made, and they seemed to be sufficiently plausible. When he found that the party was discovered in its place of concealment, he naturally sought his own safety, which he secured by plunging into the woods. In a word, he had run away in order to save his life. "This is well," returned Pathfinder, affecting to believe the other's apologies. "My brother did very wisely, but his woman followed?"
Do not the pale-faces women follow their husbands? Would not Pathfinder have looked back to see if one he loved was coming?"
This appeal was made to the guide while he was in a most fortunate frame of mind to admit its force, for Mabel and her blandishments and constancy were becoming images familiar to his thoughts. The Tuscarora, though he could not trace the reason, saw that his excuse was admitted, and he stood with quiet dignity awaiting the next inquiry. "This is reasonable and natural," returned Pathfinder. "This is natural, and may be so. A woman would be likely to follow the man to whom she had plighted faith, and husband and wife are one flesh. Your words are honest, Tuscarora," changing the language to the dialect of the other. "Your words are honest, and very pleasant and just. But why has my brother been so long from the fort? His friends have thought of him often, but have never seen him."
"If the doe follows the buck, ought not the buck to follow the doe?" answered the Tuscarora, smiling, as he laid a finger significantly on the shoulder of his interrogator. "Arrowhead's wife followed Arrowhead. It was right in Arrowhead to follow his wife. She lost her way, and they made her cook in a strange wigwam." "I understand you, Tuscarora. The woman fell into the hands of the Mingos, and you kept upon their trail." "Pathfinder can see a reason as easily as he can see the moss on the trees. It is so." "And how long have you got the woman back, and in what manner has it been done?" "2 suns. The Dew of June was not long in coming when her husband whispered to her the path." "Well, all this seems natural, and according to matrimony. But, Tuscarora, how did you get that canoe, and why are you paddling towards the St. Lawrence instead of the garrison?" "Arrowhead can tell his own from that of another. This canoe is mine. I found it on the shore near the fort." "That seems reasonable, too, for the canoe does not belong to the man, and an Indian would make few words about taking it. Still, it is extraordinary that we saw nothing of the fellow and his wife, for the canoe must have left the river before we did ourselves." This idea, which passed rapidly through the mind of the guide, was now put to the Indian in the shape of a question. "Pathfinder knows that a warrior can have shame. The father would have asked me for his daughter, and I could not give her to him. I sent the Dew of June for the canoe, and no one spoke to the woman. A Tuscarora woman would not be free in speaking to strange men." All this, too, was plausible, and in conformity with Indian character and customs. As was usual, Arrowhead had received 1/2 of his compensation previously to quitting the Mohawk, and his refraining to demand the residue was a proof of that conscientious consideration of mutual rights that quite as often distinguishes the morality of a savage as that of a Christian. To one as upright as Pathfinder, Arrowhead had conducted himself with delicacy and propriety, though it would have been more in accordance with his own frank nature to have met the father and abided by the simple truth. Still, accustomed to the ways of Indians, he saw nothing out of the ordinary track of things in the course the other had taken. "This runs like water flowing downhill, Arrowhead," he answered.
after a little reflection, "and truth obliges me to own it. It was the gift of a redskin to act in this way, though I do not think it was the gift of a pale face. You would not look upon the grief of the girl's father?" Arrowhead made a quiet inclination of the body as if to assent. "One thing more my brother will tell me," continued Pathfinder, "and there will be no cloud between his wigwam and the strong house of the Yengeese. If he can blow away this bit of fog with his breath, his friends will look at him as he sits by his own fire, and he can look at them as they lay aside their arms, and forget that they are warriors. Why was the head of Arrowhead's canoe looking towards the St. Lawrence, where there are none but enemies to be found?" "Why were the Pathfinder and his friends looking the same way?" asked the Tuscarora calmly. "A Tuscarora may look in the same direction as a Yengeese." "Why, to own the truth, Arrowhead, we are out scouting like, that is, sailing. In other words, we are on the king's business, and we have a right to be here, though we may not have a right to say why we are here." "Arrowhead saw the big canoe, and he loves to look on the face of Eau douce. He was going towards the sun at evening, in order to seek his wigwam; but, finding that the young sailor was going the other way, he turned that he might look in the same direction. Eau douce and Arrowhead were together on the last trail." "This may all be true, Tuscarora, and you are welcome. You shall eat of our venison, and then we must separate. The setting sun is behind us, and both of us move quick. My brother will get too far from that which he seeks, unless he turns round." Pathfinder now returned to the others, and repeated the result of his examination. He appeared himself to believe that the account of Arrowhead might be true, though he admitted that caution would be prudent with one he disliked; but his auditors, Jasper excepted, seemed less disposed to put faith in the explanations.
"This chap must be ironed at once, brother Dunham," said Cap,
as soon as Pathfinder finished his narration.
"He must be turned over to the master of arms, if there be any such officer on fresh water, and a court martial ought to be ordered as soon as we reach port." "I think it wisest to detain the fellow," the Sergeant answered; "but irons are unnecessary so long as he remains in the cutter. In the morning the matter shall be inquired into."
Arrowhead was now summoned and told the decision. The Indian listened gravely, and made no objections. On the contrary, he submitted with the calm and reserved dignity with which the American aborigines are known to yield to fate, and he stood apart, an attentive but calm observer of what was passing. Jasper caused the cutter's sails to be filled, and the Scud resumed her course. It was now getting near the hour to set the watch, and when it was usual to retire for the night. Most of the party went below, leaving no one on deck but Cap, the Sergeant, Jasper, and two of the crew. Arrowhead and his wife also remained, the former standing aloof in proud reserve, and the latter exhibiting, by her attitude and passiveness, the meek humility that characterizes an Indian woman.
"You will find a place for your wife below, Arrowhead, where my daughter will attend to her wants,"
said the Sergeant kindly, who was himself on the point of quitting the deck.
"Yonder is a sail where you may sleep yourself." "I thank my father. The Tuscaroras are not poor. The woman will look for my blankets in the canoe." "As you wish, my friend. We think it necessary to detain you, but not necessary to confine or to maltreat you. Send your squaw into the canoe for the blankets, and you may follow her yourself and hand us up the paddles. As there may be some sleepy heads in the Scud, Eau douce," added the Sergeant in a lower tone, "it may be well to secure the paddles." Jasper assented, and Arrowhead and his wife, with whom resistance appeared to be out of the question, silently complied with the directions. A few expressions of sharp rebuke passed from the Indian to his wife, while both were employed in the canoe, which the latter received with submissive quiet, immediately repairing an error she had made by laying aside the blanket she had taken and searching for another that was more to her tyrant's mind. "Come, bear a hand, Arrowhead,"
said the Sergeant, who stood on the gunwale overlooking the movements of the two,
which were proceeding too slowly for the impatience of a drowsy man. "It is getting late, and we soldiers have such a thing as reveille, early to bed and early to rise." "Arrowhead is coming," was the answer, as the Tuscarora stepped towards the head of his canoe. One blow of his keen knife severed the rope which held the boat, and then the cutter glanced ahead, leaving the light bubble of bark, which instantly lost its way, almost stationary. So suddenly and dexterously was this maneuver performed that the canoe was on the lee quarter of the Scud before the Sergeant was aware of the artifice, and quite in her wake ere he had time to announce it to his companions. "Hard a lee!" shouted Jasper, letting fly the jib sheet with his own hands, when the cutter came swiftly up to the breeze, with all her canvas flapping, or was running into the wind's eye, as seamen term it, until the light craft was 100 feet to windward of her former position. Quick and dexterous as was this movement, and ready as had been the expedient, it was not quicker or more ready than that of the Tuscarora. With an intelligence that denoted some familiarity with vessels, he had seized his paddle and was already skimming the water, aided by the efforts of his wife. The direction he took was southwesterly, or on a line that led him equally towards the wind and the shore, while it also kept him so far aloof from the cutter as to avoid the danger of the latter falling on board of him when she filled on the other tack. Swiftly as the Scud had shot into the wind, and far as she had forced ahead, Jasper knew it was necessary to cast her ere she had lost all her way, and it was not 2 minutes from the time the helm had been put down before the lively little craft was aback forward and rapidly falling off, in order to allow her sails to fill on the opposite tack. "He will escape!" said Jasper, the instant he caught a glimpse of the relative bearings of the cutter and the canoe. "The cunning knave is paddling dead to windward, and the Scud can never overtake him." "You have a canoe!" exclaimed the Sergeant, manifesting the eagerness of a boy to join in the pursuit. "Let us launch it, and give chase."
"It will be useless. If Pathfinder had been on deck there might have been a chance, but there is none now. To launch the canoe would have taken 3 or 4 minutes, and the time lost will be sufficient for the purposes of Arrowhead." Both Cap and the Sergeant saw the truth of this, which would have been nearly self-evident even to one unaccustomed to vessels. The shore was distant less than half a mile, and the canoe was already glancing into its shadows, at a rate to show that it would reach the land before its pursuers could probably get half the distance. The helm of the Scud was reluctantly put up again, and the cutter wore short round on her heel, coming up to her course on the other tack, as if acting on an instinct. All this was done by Jasper in profound silence, his assistants understanding what was necessary, and lending their aid in a sort of mechanical imitation. While these manoeuvres were in the course of execution, Cap took the Sergeant by a button, and led him towards the cabin door, where he was out of earshot, and began to unlock his stores of thought. "Hark ye, brother Dunham," said he, with an ominous face, "this is a matter that requires mature thought and much circumspection." "The life of a soldier, brother Cap, is one of constant thought and circumspection. On this frontier, were we to overlook either, our scalps might be taken from our heads in the first nap." "But I consider this escape of Arrowhead as a circumstance, and I might add his escape as another. This Jasper Freshwater must look to it." "They are both circumstances truly, brother, but they tell different ways. If it is a circumstance against the lad that the Indian has escaped, it is a circumstance in his favor that he was first taken." "Ay, ay, but two circumstances do not contradict each other like two negatives. If you will follow the advice of an old seaman, Sergeant, not a moment is to be lost in taking the steps necessary for the security of the vessel and all on board of her. The cutter is now slipping through the water at the rate of 6 knots, and as the distances are so short on this bit of a pond, we may all find ourselves in a French port before morning and in a French prison before night." "This may be true enough. What would you advise me to do, brother?" "In my opinion, you should put this Master Freshwater under arrest on the spot, send him below under the charge of a sentinel, and transfer the command of the cutter to me. All this you have power to perform,
the craft belonging to the army, and you being the commanding officer of the troops present." Sergeant Dunham deliberated more than an hour on the propriety of this proposal; for, though sufficiently prompt when his mind was really made up, he was habitually thoughtful and wary. The habit of superintending the personal police of the garrison had made him acquainted with character, and he had long been disposed to think well of Jasper. Still that subtle poison, suspicion, had entered his soul, and so much were the artifices and intrigues of the French dreaded, that, especially warned as he had been by his commander, it is not to be wondered that the recollection of years of good conduct should vanish under the influence of a distrust so keen, and seemingly so plausible. In this embarrassment the Sergeant consulted the quartermaster, whose opinion, as his superior, he felt bound to respect, though at the moment independent of his control. It is an unfortunate occurrence for one who is in a dilemma to ask advice of another who is desirous of standing well in his favor, the party consulted being almost certain to try to think in the manner which will be the most agreeable to the party consulting. In the present instance it was equally unfortunate, as respects a candid consideration of the subject, that Cap, instead of the Sergeant himself, made the statement of the case; for the earnest old sailor was not backward in letting his listener perceive to which side he was desirous that the quartermaster should lean. Lieutenant Muir was much too politic to offend the uncle and father of the woman he hoped and expected to win, had he really thought the case admitted of doubt; but, in the manner in which the facts were submitted to him, he was seriously inclined to think that it would be well to put the control of the Scud temporarily into the management of Cap, as a precaution against treachery. This opinion then decided the Sergeant, who forthwith set about the execution of the necessary measures. Without entering into any explanations, Sergeant Dunham simply informed Jasper that he felt it to be his duty to deprive him temporarily of the command of the cutter, and to confer it on his own brother-in-law. A natural and involuntary burst of surprise, which escaped the young man, was met by a quiet remark, reminding him that military service was often of a nature that required concealment, and a declaration that the present duty was of such a character that this particular arrangement had become indispensable. Although Jasper's astonishment remained undiminished, the Sergeant cautiously abstaining from making any allusion to his suspicions, the young man was accustomed to obey with military submission, and he quietly acquiesced, with his own mouth directing the little crew to receive their further orders from Cap until another change should be effected. When, however, he was told the case required that not only he himself, but his principal assistant, who, on account of his long acquaintance with the lake, was usually termed the pilot, were to remain below, there was an alteration in his countenance and manner that denoted strong feeling, though it was so well mastered as to leave even the distrustful Cap in doubt as to its meaning. As a matter of course, however, when distrust exists, it was not long before the worst construction was put upon it. As soon as Jasper and the pilot were below, the sentinel at the hatch received private orders to pay particular attention to both, to allow neither to come on deck again without giving instant notice to the person who might then be in charge of the cutter, and to insist on his return below as soon as possible. This precaution, however, was uncalled for, Jasper and his assistant both throwing themselves silently on their pallets, which neither quitted again that night. "And now, Sergeant," said Cap, as soon as he had found himself master of the deck, "you will just have the goodness to give me the courses and distance, that I may see the boat keeps her head the right way." "I know nothing of either, brother Cap," returned Dunham, not a little embarrassed at the question. "We must make the best of our way to the station among the Thousand Islands, where we shall land, relieve the party that is already out, and get information for our future government. That's it, nearly word for word, as it stands in the written orders." "But you can muster a chart, something in the way of bearings and distances, that I may see the road?" "I do not think Jasper ever had anything of the sort to go by." "No chart, Sergeant Dunham!" Not a scrap of a pen, even. Our sailors navigate this lake without any aid from maps." "The devil they do! They must be regular yahoos. And do you suppose, Sergeant Dunham, that I can find one island out of 1,000 without knowing its name or its position, without even a course or a distance?" "As for the name, brother Cap, you need not be particular, for not one of the whole 1,000 has a name, and so a mistake can never be made on that score. As for the position, never having been there myself, I can tell you nothing about it, nor do I think its position of any particular consequence, provided we find the spot. Perhaps one of the hands on deck can tell us the way." "Hold on, Sergeant. Hold on a moment, if you please, Sergeant Dunham. If I am to command this craft, it must be done, if you please, without holding any councils of war with the cook and cabin boy. A shipmaster is a shipmaster, and he must have an opinion of his own, even if it be a wrong one. I suppose you know service well enough to understand that it is better in a commander to go wrong than to go nowhere. At all events, the Lord High Admiral couldn't command a yawl with dignity, if he consulted the coxswain every time he wished to go ashore. No, sir. If I sink, I sink. But, damn me, I'll go down ship-shape and with dignity." "But, brother Cap, I have no wish to go down anywhere, unless it be to the station among the 1,000 islands whither we are bound." "Well, well, Sergeant, rather than ask advice, that is, direct, barefaced advice, of a foremast hand, or any other than a quarter-deck officer, I would go round to the whole 1,000, and examine them one by one until we got the right haven. But there is such a thing as coming at an opinion without manifesting ignorance, and I will manage to rouse all there is out of these hands, and make them think all the while that I am cramming them with my own experience. We are sometimes obliged to use the glass at sea, when there is nothing in sight, or to heave the lead long before we strike soundings. When a youngster, I sailed 2 voyages with a man who navigated his ship pretty much by the latter sort of information, which sometimes answers." "I know we are steering in the right direction at present," returned the Sergeant, "but in the course of a few hours we shall be up with a headland, where we must feel our way with more caution." "Leave me to pump the man at the wheel, brother, and you shall see that I will make him suck in a very few minutes." Cap and the Sergeant now walked aft, until they stood by the sailor who was at the helm, Cap maintaining an air of security and tranquillity, like one who was entirely confident of his own powers. "There is a wholesome air, my lad," Cap observed, in the manner that a superior on board a vessel sometimes condescends to use to a favored inferior. "Of course you have it in this fashion off the land every night?" "At this season of the year, sir," the man returned, touching his hat, out of respect, to his new commander and Sergeant Dunham's connection. "The same thing, I take it, among the 1,000 islands? The wind will stand, of course, though we shall then have land on every side of us." "When we get further east, sir, the wind will probably shift, for there can then be no particular land breeze." "Ay, ay, so much for your fresh water. It is always some trick that is opposed to nature. Now, down among the West India Islands, one is just as certain of having a land breeze as he is of having a sea breeze. In that respect there is no difference, though it's quite in rule it should be different up here on this bit of fresh water. Of course, my lad, you know all about these said 1,000 islands?" "Lord bless you, Master Cap, nobody knows all about them or anything about them. They are a puzzle to the oldest sailor on the lake, and we don't pretend to know even their names. For that matter, most of them have no more names than a child that dies before it is christened." "Are you a Roman Catholic?" demanded the Sergeant sharply. "No, sir, nor anything else. I'm a generalizer about religion, never troubling that which don't trouble me." "Humph! A generalizer, that is, no doubt, one of the new sects that afflict the country," muttered Mr. Dunham, whose grandfather had been a New Jersey Quaker, his father a Presbyterian, and who had joined the Church of England himself after he entered the army. "I take it, John," resumed Cap, Your name is Jack, I believe."
"No, sir. I am called Robert."
"Ay, Robert, it's very much the same thing. Jack or Bob, we use the two indifferently. I say, Bob, it's good holding ground, is it, down at this same station for which we are bound?"
"Bless you, sir, I know no more about it than one of the Mohawks, or a soldier of the 55th.
"Did you never anchor there?"
"Never, sir. Master Eau douce always makes fast to the shore."
"But in running in for the town, you kept the lead going, out of question, and must have tallowed as usual."
"Tallow! And town too! Bless your heart, Master Cap, there is no more town than there is on your chin, and not half as much tallow." The Sergeant smiled grimly, but his brother-in-law did not detect this proof of humor.
"No church tower, nor light, no fort, huh? There is a garrison, as you call it hereaway, at least?"
"Ask Sergeant Dunham, sir, if you wish to know that. All the garrison is on board the Scud."
"But in running in, Bob, which of the channels do you think the best? The one you went last, or the other?"
"I can't say, sir. I know nothing of either."
"You didn't go to sleep, fellow, at the wheel, did you?"
"Not at the wheel, sir, but down in the forepeak in my berth. Eau douce sent us below, soldiers and all, with the exception of the pilot. We know no more of the road than if we had never been over it. This he has always done in going in and coming out, and, for the life of me, I could tell you nothing of the channel, or the course, after we are once fairly up with the islands. No one knows anything of either but Jasper and the pilot."
"Here is a circumstance for you, Sergeant," said Cap, leading his brother-in-law a little aside. "There is no one on board to pump, for they all suck from ignorance at the first stroke of the brake. How the devil am I to find the way to this station for which we are bound?"
"Sure enough, brother Cap. Your question is more easily put than answered. Is there no such thing as figuring it out by navigation? I thought you saltwater mariners were able to do as small a thing as that. I have often read of their discovering islands, surely."
"That you have, brother, that you have, and this discovery would be the greatest of them all, for it would not only be discovering one island, but one island out of 1,000.
Still, the sailors of the lake have a method of finding the places they wish to go to."
"If I have understood you, Sergeant, this station or blockhouse is particularly private."
"It is indeed, the utmost care having been taken to prevent a knowledge of its position from reaching the enemy."
"And you expect me, a stranger on your lake, to find this place without chart, course, distance, latitude, longitude, or soundings, ay, damn me, or tallow? Allow me to ask if you think a mariner runs by his nose, like one of Pathfinder's hounds?"
"Well, brother, you may yet learn something by questioning the young man at the helm. I can hardly think that he is as ignorant as he pretends to be."
This looks like another circumstance. For that matter, the case is getting to be so full of circumstances that one hardly knows how to foot up the evidence. But we will soon see how much the lad knows. Cap and the Sergeant now returned to their station near the helm, and the former renewed his inquiries. "Do you happen to know what may be the latitude and longitude of this said island, my lad?" he asked.
"The what, sir?"
"Why, the latitude or longitude, one or both, I'm not particular which, as I merely inquire in order to see how they bring up young men on this bit of fresh water."
"I'm not particular about either myself, sir, and so I do not happen to know what you mean."
"Not what I mean. You know what latitude is?"
"Not I, sir," returned the man, hesitating, "though I believe it is French for the upper lakes."
"Whew!"
whistled Cap, drawing out his breath like the broken stop of an organ.
"Latitude, French for the upper lakes! Harkee, young man, do you know what longitude means?" I believe I do, sir. That is, 5 feet 6, the regulation height for soldiers in the king's service."
"There's the longitude found out for you, Sergeant, in the rattling of a brace block. You have some notion about a degree, and minutes and seconds, I hope?"
"Yes, sir. Degree means my betters, and minutes and seconds are for the short or long log lines. We all know these things as well as the salt water people."
"Damn me, brother Dunham, if I think even faith can get along on this lake, much as they say it can do with mountains. Well, my lad, you understand the azimuth and measuring distances and how to box the compass?"
"As for the first, sir, I can't say I do. The distances we all know, as we measured them from point to point; and as for boxing the compass, I will turn my back to no admiral in his Majesty's fleet. North, and by east, northeast, northeast, and by north, northeast, and by east, east, northeast, east, and by northeast. That will do, that will do. You'll bring about a shift of wind if you go on this manner."
"I see very plainly, Sergeant," walking away again and dropping his voice, "we've nothing to hope for from that chap. I'll stand on 2 hours longer on this tack, when we'll heave to and get the soundings, after which we will be governed by circumstances." To this the Sergeant made no objections, and as the wind grew lighter, as usual with the advance of night, and there were no immediate obstacles to the navigation, he made a bed of a sail on deck, and was soon lost in the sound sleep of a soldier. Cap continued to walk the deck, for he was one whose iron frame set fatigue at defiance, and not once that night did he close his eyes. It was broad daylight when Sergeant Dunham awoke, and the exclamation of surprise that escaped him, as he rose to his feet and began to look about him, was stronger than it was usual for one so drilled to suffer to be heard. He found the weather entirely changed, the view bounded by driving mist that limited the visible horizon to a circle of about a mile in diameter, the lake raging and covered with foam, and the Scud lying to. A brief conversation with his brother-in-law let him into the secrets of all these sudden changes. According to the account of Master Cap, the wind had died away to a calm about midnight, and just as he was thinking of heaving to sound, for islands ahead were beginning to be seen. At 1 a.m. it began to blow from the northeast, accompanied by a drizzle, and he stood off to the northward and westward, knowing that the coast of New York lay in the opposite direction. At 1:30 he stowed the flying jib, reefed the mainsail, and took the bonnet off the jib. At 2 he was compelled to get a second reef aft, and by 2:30 he had put a balance reef in the sail, and was lying to. "I can't say but the boat behaves well, Sergeant," the old sailor added, "but it blows 42-pounders. I had no idea there were any such currents of air up here on this bit of fresh water, though I care not the knotting of a yarn for it, as your lake has now somewhat of a natural look, and if this damned water had a savor of salt about it, one might be comfortable." "How long have you been heading in this direction, brother Cap?" inquired the prudent soldier. "And at what rate may we be going through the water?" "Why, 2 or 3 hours, mayhap, and she went like a horse for the first pair of them. Oh, we've a fine offing now; for, to own the truth, little relishing the neighborhood of them said islands, though they are to windward, I took the helm myself, and run her off free for some league or two. We are well to leeward of them, I'll engage. I say to leeward, for though one might wish to be well to windward of one island, or even half a dozen, when it comes to 1,000, the better way is to give it up at once, and to slide down under their lee as fast as possible. No, there they are, up yonder in the dingle, and there they may stay for anything Charles Cap cares."
"As the north shore lies only some 5 or 6 leagues from us, brother, and I know there is a large bay in that quarter, might it not be well to consult some of the crew concerning our position, if indeed we do not call up Jasper Eau douce, and tell him to carry us back to Oswego? For it is quite impossible we should ever reach the station with this wind directly in our teeth." There are several serious professional reasons, Sergeant, against all your propositions. In the first place, an admission of ignorance on the part of a commander would destroy discipline. No matter, brother. I understand your shake of the head, but nothing capsizes discipline so much as to confess ignorance. I once knew a master of a vessel who went a week on a wrong course rather than allow he had made a mistake, and it was surprising how much he rose in the opinions of his people, just because they could not understand him.
That may do on salt water, brother Cap, but it will hardly do on fresh. Rather than wreck my command on the Canada shore, I shall feel it a duty to take Jasper out of arrest."
"And make a haven in Frontenac. No, Sergeant, the Scud is in good hands, and will now learn something of seamanship. We have a fine offing, and no one but a madman would think of going upon a coast in a gale like this. I shall wear every watch, and then we shall be safe against all dangers but those of the drift, which, in a light, low craft like this, without top hamper, will be next to nothing. Leave it all to me, Sergeant, and I pledge you the character of Charles Cap that all will go well."
Sergeant Dunham was fain to yield. He had great confidence in his connection's professional skill, and hoped that he would take such care of the cutter as would amply justify his opinion of him. On the other hand, as distrust, like care, grows by what it feeds on, he entertained so much apprehension of treachery that he was quite willing any one but Jasper should just then have the control of the fate of the whole party. Truth, moreover, compels us to admit another motive. The particular duty on which he was now sent of night should have been confided to a commissioned officer, and Major Duncan had excited a good deal of discontent among the subalterns of the garrison by having confided it to one of the sergeant's humble station. To return without having even reached the point of destination, therefore, the latter felt it would be a failure from which he was not likely soon to recover, and the measure would at once be the means of placing a superior in his shoes. End of chapter.